Hey, it's KR of D&D Homebrew talking today about what I consider one of the most evocative settings for an RPG game, and that is the bog, right? The bog is one of those places. It's mysterious, it's scary, it's hard to get to, get into, get out of. It's one of these places that anytime you have places where ordinary humanoids don't want to go, you have a place that'll make for good adventures because things that want to avoid this or places that have become this, again, in a fantasy setting, are really fruitful. And a bog, it's different than a swamp or a marsh because a bog, by its nature, it's formed from rainwater, not from streams or rivers or, underground springs. And because of that, it gets very acidic, silty. It's not a place of life. There are some very specific plants, animals that live there. Interestingly, one of the plants that thrives in a bog are carnivorous plants, which is great for a fantasy setting. But it also, the terrain itself, because of the water everywhere, the grass that grows is spongy. It has water underneath. It's a natural setting for the sort of quicksand or traps that are very effective when people are going through. You need to know your way through a bog. It's not always that you can, like a swamp or marsh, you can take boats through or whatever. Oftentimes it appears in many areas to be solid land, and then you step in some place and you sink in. Very difficult to get out. But the other thing about bogs is they preserve things. The famous, bog people that have been found, prehistoric people, oftentimes buried there ritualistically with the ropes tight around their necks. They were sacrificed for some purpose. Clearly, in these early sort of Neolithic people, the bog was this place where you took people and did this. It had some kind of spiritual significance. Whether or not people cut the peat and did all this stuff in the bog, but I don't think they lived there, right? But they took their sacrifice victims in the bog. So we think of some sort of gods that need to be appeased, and the gateway to them is through the bog. But this preservation, the tannins and the materials in the water and the soil preserve these bodies such that when you see them, when they've been discovered by peat farmers, they look totally preserved, even though they're 20, 30,000 years old. I don't know if they're that old, but you know what I'm saying. Maybe 10,000, whatever it is. They look like they would just wake right up and look at you. And that preservation, that quality of it, you think about it in a fantasy setting, is very fruitful because, it preserves secrets. It preserves artifacts. It preserves, some scroll that was put in there for thousands of years. Again, would it dissolve those things in real life? But the idea of a bog having these qualities, being imbued with some kind of spiritual power, and being a place where it's tough to get in and out of, nasty things live there. Again, in a fantasy setting, everything is up. The carnivorous plants are huge. The creatures that dwell there, hags and stuff like that. I mean, again, we don't think of go to the bog village. Maybe the villagers nearby go in there to cut peat, but they're careful. And they know the routes in and out. They don't stay there overnight because, again, the bog preserves memories, right? The bog arose after the great battle. The blood stained the soil, and as such, nothing would grow there, this sort of thing. And so that water that would accumulate then turn the ground into this spongy, weird mass. And the other element in here is, you have layer after layer after layer of this sediment such that you could have a bog that was created when landforms changed or whatever, and there was some. I used a bog. I talk about this in my PDF. I had these creatures, bog walkers, and I had this sunken chapel, this horrific place of evil, right? And this bog, rose up around this chapel because it seemed like such an obvious, it was so desecrated and, this horrible rites and whatnot. This is the kind of terrain that would rise up in a magic-imbued world. And for that reason, I would make the sounds of a bog very, muffled or strange. And you're also going to have environmental effects in a bog. The mist that rises up from this combination of the wet soil, the various pools of water that are everywhere, and whether it makes sense meteorologically, who cares, right? This is the gothic sort of atmosphere, right? Of the Hounds of the Baskervilles or Wuthering Heights or something. This is where, the lonely mad genius, inherits his castle in a bog that no one wanted. So I think what you want to do is you want to set up a situation where you have this bog area. Let's say, depending on if you're using hex run, because, a hex in a world might be 6 miles, might be 10, 20, whatever it is. It might be a multi-hex. I used to have multi-hex areas like this. So you have kind of the outer perimeter of your bog where it starts to, you can see that the terrain is changing. You can see the ground is getting spongy, right? And the grass, this weird, very green moss or something is going. Or the players hear from villagers or whatnot, oh, the bog of, the hollow bog is over that way. I wouldn't go that way. But of course, the players, if they have some reason to go there, some legend, or they're chasing some lead or whatever, they know they want to go into this bog. Then the next question is, how do you navigate? Is a map enough? Do you need a local to take you through? Are you entrusting if you have a ranger or druid or someone in your party, depending on your system, that can navigate their way? But if they're not familiar with that terrain, there could be a real chance that something's going to happen in this bog. So you're already establishing that it's difficult to find your way through. Here again, to not get lost. Because you can get lost in let's say, 5 or 6 hexes, depending on how big they are, and you're wandering around. You get lost in there. If you set it up as terrain, you can get lost in. Oftentimes in the modern RPGs, we used to just roll to see if you got lost way back when. So you have specialized terrain where you say you can get lost and go around in circles because why? Not only is it difficult to figure your way, everything looks the same, but any misstep and you could fall into one of these traps. And again, think about traps. How are you going to do, you step in this soil and you fall in maybe up to your waist. So how difficult is that? Can people just lift you out? Or is that mud under that stuff got a tremendous suction power? That's there's no way you're going to get out by yourself. You can't climb up. People have to pull you out. But it's trying to, that suction is holding you in. Much less if there's any creatures, say homebrewed, that live in that muck. And when something falls in, that's how they feed, right? So you wander off too far from some path of safety, you suddenly fall into this trap. It's a natural trap. And once that happens one time, the players are like, this is kind of deadly. So you've got the chance of getting lost. You've got the difficulty of the terrain. And then if you're going to be fighting things, does that include you have a lot of difficult or even, extra difficult, depending on your system, major difficult or whatever it is? Because when you're moving here, you are looking around and you're constantly worried about, am I going to fall into one of this kind of situation? Am I going to fall into one of these pits? So then depending on your battle, because if you have a battle and there's some clear terrain where people are fighting, depending on your system and how you play, but I play with miniatures or tokens on a virtual tabletop, and you have areas that are difficult and you're trying to maneuver around, it can be tricky. Especially if you're fighting things that it's not difficult terrain to them. This is where they live. They know how to walk over these spongy areas, or they can just look at it and see the areas that are safe to walk on. You can't, or the players can't. That makes for interesting combat. And then I would say that the origins of a bog, naturally, as I say, rainwater goes into a lower area and stays and creates this boggy kind of atmosphere. Maybe you had a pond that was not a pond with any kind of spring or river flowing through it, water collected. And then as the pond filled in, it became first a swamp and then later a bog, but also a cursed area. Because if you think about it, the bog, no one's going to live there. That shows, you made some transgression against the gods that was so severe. Look at what they did to this place. And it's now a bog. It's now this land where it's unsafe to walk. And things sink down into the bog. How deep is it ultimately? If you have this huge chasm, let's say it's 100 feet deep, and over the centuries the silt and the water flows, and the silt flows in, fills up 100 feet deep. So there you have this, but under here, not only, your weight's not necessarily going to carry you down if you step in it, but what's in there? what has been subsumed or what has been, encased by this slowly. The silt is coming off these hills, and the way the water table goes and whatnot, it's just filling up and creating this bog. The bog preserves secrets, just like it preserves the bodies of those entombed there. It preserves these dwellings, these, again, when I've done it, it preserves memories and all sorts of stuff. And I would add, I did this for my Patreon. I created these creatures in this bog, and I talked about the preserved bodies. And I talked about how when you see those bodies that have been taken out of a bog, and now they're encased in glass, so that because once they go out into the air, they'll start to decompose. So they put them in these glass cases, and you're looking at them. And as I said, they look like they could just open up their eyes and say hello. That's how well preserved they are. Well, in a fantasy setting, RPG setting, my friends, they do, right? You find someone in the bog, they've been magically, that soil isn't just a natural phenomenon. It's imbued with magic. It's taking the natural qualities of the soil that preserves things, but then it's keeping their organs or whatever alive. I went over a bunch of these in this video I made for the Patreon where I talked about what could be the implications of this place. That is a powerful thing. And that is the power of this setting, the mystery of the bog. It's I think, it's perhaps the, super deep ocean, because we can't breathe water, is the most mysterious place. And people will say, well, the Arctic, right at the poles, Antarctica is just impossible to live in. I get that. But the bog has that gothic sort of creepy, eerie mystery to it that is unlike any other terrain, and I think perfect for both, the RPG fantasy setting, but also something like the Call of Cthulhu type setting or whatever, right? That's just made for that. That's why Hound of the Baskervilles, that Moor, as they called it there, is another character in that story, and it can be a character in your adventures as well. And of course, a shout out to my Patreon supporters. The bog was a big part of this week's the PDF I made in the video. Really appreciate it. Appreciate all of you. Comment to me, give a like, whatever you want. And most importantly, my friends, as always, keep playing an RPG game, whichever one you choose, and tell somebody else about it.